My name is Eleanor Wright. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been known as the steady one, the calm wife, the reliable partner, the person who doesn't raise her voice or make scenes. If you ask people who know me casually, they'd probably say I'm reasonable, grounded, maybe even a little quiet. The kind of woman who listens more than she speaks, who smooths things over, who doesn't let emotions get the better of her. What they don't usually see is that quiet doesn't mean passive. It never did. I'm sharing this story not because it's dramatic, and not because it ends with revenge or triumph in the way movies like to frame things. I'm sharing it because it's honest, because it's about a moment that looks small from the outside, but changes something fundamental on the inside. And because I know there are people listening who have lived inside similar silences, wondering when, if ever, something finally shifts. My husband told me to calm down while I was packing to leave. And yes, that sentence ended everything. This is not a story about shouting matches or explosive fights. There was no slamming door, no thrown objects, no final cinematic argument where everything spills out at once. What happened was quieter than that, almost mundane, but it was irreversible. Over the next hour, I'm going to walk you through the emotional landscape of a marriage where being easygoing slowly turned into being unseen, where small dismissals were framed as nothing until they formed a pattern that could no longer be ignored, where silence wasn't weakness, but a space in which clarity grew. I won't exaggerate events. I won't paint myself as perfect or my husband as a villain. This isn't about assigning blame or winning a moral contest. It's about noticing, about the moment you realize you've been shrinking to fit a role you never agreed to play, and the calm resolve that follows when you decide to stop. If you're here expecting drama, you might be disappointed. But if you're here because you've ever been told you're overreacting, too sensitive, or simply need to calm down, then you'll understand why this story matters. Before we begin the story itself, I want to be clear. This is told from my perspective, with the benefit of distance and reflection. It's not meant to inflame. It's meant to illuminate. So let me ask you gently, before we go any further, have you ever noticed the exact moment when something inside you went quiet? Not because you gave up, but because you finally understood? For a long time, I believed that being easy to live with was a kind of virtue. I was the woman people described with phrases like low maintenance and so understanding. At dinners, friends would smile and say, "Eleanor is the calm one," usually after someone else had gotten emotional or upset. My husband would nod along, sometimes with a half smile, as if this were one of my defining features, like eye color or height. Calm, steady, reasonable. It sounded like a compliment. I accepted it as one. In our marriage, I was the emotional buffer, the one who remembered birthdays, smoothed over awkward conversations, and followed up with thank you notes. If something went wrong, I adjusted. If plans changed, I adapted. If someone was tired or stressed, I made space. I told myself this was maturity, partnership, love expressed through consideration. What I didn't notice at first was how invisible that role made me. I wasn't unseen in the obvious ways. My husband knew where I was. He relied on me. He trusted me to handle things. But there's a difference between being relied on and being regarded, between being useful and being witnessed. At work, it was similar. I was the person managers leaned on when projects were behind, the one who stayed late without making a show of it, the one who solved problems quietly, then stepped back while others took credit more loudly. People assumed I was fine with that because I never protested, and they were right. I didn't protest, not because I didn't care, but because I didn't yet see the pattern. I had learned somewhere along the way that expressing dissatisfaction made you difficult. That is asking for more required justification. That if you could carry the weight without complaint, you probably should. So I carried it, calmly, competently. In my marriage, this translated into being the one who adjusted her expectations. If my husband forgot something important to me, I told myself it wasn't intentional. If he dismissed a concern with humor, I laughed along. If he interrupted me, I waited until he finished. There was always a rational explanation, always a way to smooth the moment over. From the outside, we looked solid. No screaming fights, no public tension. People would say, "You two are so stable," as if stability were the same as mutual awareness. What they didn't see was how rarely anyone asked what I needed, and how rarely I volunteered the answer. I became very good at anticipating others, reading tone shifts, sensing irritation before it surfaced, adjusting my behavior to keep things running smoothly. This skill was praised. It made life easier for everyone around me, but it also trained them not to look too closely at me. When you don't demand space, people stop making room. I don't say this with bitterness. At the time, I didn't feel wronged. I felt functional, like a well-organized system that didn't require attention because it didn't break down. And systems that don't break down are often ignored. My husband didn't wake up one day deciding to undervalue me. There was no cruelty in the beginning. There was comfort, familiarity, assumption. He assumed I was fine because I always was, or at least I appeared to be. And I assumed that if something truly mattered, I would know how to speak up. The truth is, I didn't know how, not without feeling like I was disrupting the peace I had helped create. So I stayed quiet. I listened. I adapted. I told myself this was what grown relationships look like. Two people compromising, one of them just a little more often. Over time, that little more often became my default position. I was the reliable one, the reasonable one, the calm one. And slowly, without anyone explicitly deciding it, I became the one whose inner world didn't need checking in on. Because if there were a problem, surely I would say something. That assumption sat quietly between us, unquestioned. So did I. The first time it happened, I didn't register it as an injury. It was so minor that if I described it to someone else, I would have softened it before it left my mouth. I would have added context, tone, a disclaimer. He didn't mean it like that. It was a stressful day. I'm probably reading too much into it. That's how small cuts survive. They hide inside explanations. We were standing at the kitchen talking about something unimportant. Weekend plans, I think. I had been explaining why I felt uneasy about a commitment we'd made, something that would stretch my schedule thin. I wasn't emotional. I wasn't upset. I was doing what I always did, laying out information carefully, calmly, making sure my words didn't sound accusatory. Halfway through my sentence, he glanced at his phone. It was quick, almost reflexive, a tiny shift of attention, but he didn't look back up right away. He nodded once, vaguely, the way people do when they want you to keep talking, but aren't actually listening. I paused. "Are you hearing me?" I asked, still neutral, still gentle. He smiled just slightly. Yeah, you're overthinking it." That was it. No harsh tone, no argument, just a mild dismissal wrapped in familiarity. And because it was wrapped so neatly, I accepted it. I let the conversation move on. I told myself it wasn't worth slowing everything down over something so small, but something in me noticed. Not angrily, not defensively, just attentively. I noticed how quickly my concern had been categorized as unnecessary, how easily my perspective had been waved away, and how automatic my response was to retreat, to recalibrate, to make myself less inconvenient. Later that evening, I replayed the moment in my head while doing dishes, not because I was upset, but because it lingered, like a line you reread in a book, unsure why it stood out. I realized that if the roles were reversed, if he had expressed uncertainty, even casually, I would have put my phone down. I would have asked a follow-up question. I would have treated his unease as information, not noise. That realization didn't hurt, not yet. What hurt, quietly, was how normal it felt for me to expect that level of attention from myself, but not from him. I didn't bring it up. I told myself it would sound petty, that it would create tension where there didn't need to be any. And besides, I had already absorbed the message. This wasn't important enough to hold space for. Over the next few weeks, similar moments appeared. A comment interrupted mid-thought. A decision was made without asking my opinion because you're fine either way. A joke at my expense that landed just a second too long. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. Other people didn't notice. Why would they? I barely acknowledged it myself, but my body noticed before my mind did. I started choosing my words more carefully, editing thoughts before they reached my mouth, prefacing opinions with disclaimers. This might be silly, but it's probably nothing. I don't feel strongly about it, but Each small adjustment felt reasonable on its own. Sensible, considerate. Together, they formed a pattern. The cut wasn't that he disagreed with me. Disagreement is normal. The cut was that my inner experience was being gently, consistently downgraded, treated as less relevant, less precise, less necessary to fully engage with. And the most dangerous part, I helped him do it by not pausing the conversation, by not saying that mattered to me, by choosing harmony over accuracy. I wasn't being silenced. I was cooperating in my own quieting. That night, lying in bed beside him, I watched the ceiling fan spin and thought, not for the last time. Maybe this is just how long relationships settle. Maybe this is what comfort looks like. I didn't know that comfort, when it only moves in one direction, eventually becomes erasure. At the time, it was just a small cut. And like most small cuts, it didn't bleed enough to alarm anyone. Once something happens more than once, the mind looks for a framework to hold it. The easiest framework is normalization. After that first small cut, I began to adjust. Not consciously, not dramatically, but in 1,000 quiet calibrations that felt like maturity. If a comment landed wrong, I assumed the intention mattered more than the impact. If my thoughts were brushed aside, I told myself I hadn't explained them clearly enough. There was always a way to take responsibility without asking anyone else to. This is how patterns become invisible. They're framed as personal shortcomings instead of shared dynamics. My husband didn't suddenly become unkind. He became efficient with me. He shortened conversations, finished my sentences, responded to concerns with solutions instead of curiosity. When I spoke carefully, he heard hesitation. When I paused to think, he filled the silence. And I let him. I told myself I was being considerate, that I was choosing my battles, that marriage wasn't about insisting on being understood all the time. But something subtle shifted in how I occupied space. I stopped bringing things up unless I was sure they were worth it. I learned which topics led to impatience and which ones earned engagement. I refined my tone to sound neutral even when I wasn't. I became adept at presenting emotional information as logistics. If I said, I'm feeling overwhelmed, it became, I just need to adjust the schedule. If I said, that hurt, it became, it's not a big deal, but each translation moved me one step further away from my actual experience. What made it harder to notice was that nothing was overtly wrong. We still laughed. We still functioned well together. There were no explosive arguments to point to, no clear line that said, this is unacceptable. Instead, there was a gradual erosion of presence. When I spoke, he listened just enough to respond, not enough to absorb. His attention skimmed the surface of my words. And because I didn't stop him, that surface became all he ever saw. Friends would say, you're so patient, when I described minor frustrations. I wore that word like a badge of honor. Patient sounded noble, controlled, adult. I didn't realize that patience without reciprocity is just endurance with better branding. There were moments when I felt the urge to push back, to say, no, you didn't hear me, or please don't minimize this. But each time a familiar thought intervened, is this really the hill to die on? So I chose not to die on any hill at all. I rationalized staying quiet by telling myself I was avoiding unnecessary conflict. I believed that being low reactive made me strong. That emotional restraint was the same thing as emotional intelligence. In reality, I was training the people around me, including my husband, on how little care my inner life required. He began making decisions assuming my agreement. If I hesitated, he interpreted it as indecision. If I disagreed, he framed it as stress. And if I persisted, he would sigh, softly, almost imperceptibly, as if I were introducing friction into an otherwise smooth system. That sigh did more than words ever could. It told me I was becoming inefficient, so I adapted again. I streamlined myself. I preempted objections. I learned to sound agreeable even when I wasn't fully aligned. From the outside, I looked calm, balanced, unbothered. Inside, I felt like I was slowly translating myself into a language that required fewer and fewer words. The strange part is that I didn't feel angry. I felt tired of deciding which parts of me were worth expressing, tired of monitoring tone, tired of being the emotional adult in every room. But I kept going because nothing was wrong enough to stop. Disrespect doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives as an assumption, as familiarity, as the belief that someone will always adjust. You don't have to. And when you normalize that belief, you don't notice when your voice becomes optional. I didn't yet understand that I was being slowly edited out of my own marriage. I only knew that speaking less felt easier, and I mistook ease for peace. Roles form quietly. No one announces them. No one signs a contract. They emerge from repetition, from what's rewarded and what's ignored, from who adapts first and who never has to. By the time you notice you're in one, it already feels permanent. My role was simple. I was the reliable one. The one who didn't need much. The one who handled things. The one who stayed composed when others were reactive. In my marriage, that role became so familiar that it stopped being visible. It was just how Eleanor is. If something needed organizing, I did it. If emotions ran high, I de-escalated. If there was tension in a room, I absorbed it quietly, like insulation. People felt better around me, lighter, less burdened. And because I was good at it, no one questioned whether I wanted to keep doing it. My husband leaned into this version of me without realizing he was leaning at all. He spoke more freely. He vented. He assumed understanding. When he was frustrated, I listened. When he was distracted, I waited. When he was stressed, I made myself smaller to compensate. It wasn't that he demanded this. It's that I provided it so consistently that it became expected. Expectation is a powerful thing. It doesn't need enforcement, it just needs repetition. Over time, I noticed that when I did express a need, clearly, calmly, it was met with mild surprise. As if I were stepping out of character. The response wasn't hostile, just confused. A subtle, "This isn't like you." And that confusion worked. It nudged me back into place. I began to see myself through the role as well. I told myself I was the steady one, the adaptable one, the emotionally regulated adult. I wore that identity proudly. It made me feel superior in a quiet way, above drama, above messiness. But there's a cost to being the easy one. You become the last person people check in on. When you don't react strongly, your reactions stop being anticipated. When you don't complain, your comfort stops being considered. When you carry things well, people forget they're heavy. I remember a moment at a small gathering with friends. Someone asked how married life was going, and my husband answered before I could. "Great," he said. "We're low drama." Everyone laughed. I smiled. I didn't contradict him, but something about that phrase stayed with me. Low drama. It sounded like a compliment. It was meant to be one. But it also reduced our dynamic to how little I disrupted it. In that role, my depth was irrelevant. My internal process was optional. As long as things ran smoothly, no one needed to look closer. I realized then that I had been cast not as a partner, but as a stabilizer. Stabilizers don't get asked how they feel. They are used to keep things from tipping. The realization didn't make me angry. It made me quiet in a different way, more observant. I started watching how often my presence was noticed, only when something needed to be fixed. How my absence of complaint was taken as confirmation that everything was fine. And I saw my own complicity clearly. I had trained people to interact with me this way, by always being available, always being composed, always being reasonable. I had mistaken self-erasure for self-control. Once you see the role you've been assigned, you can't unsee it. And once you see how comfortable others are with you staying inside it, you start to understand something unsettling. If you change, the system will resist. Not because you're wrong, but because you're no longer predictable. I didn't know yet what I would do with that understanding. I only knew that the role no longer fit, and that staying in it would require me to keep shrinking. The shift didn't happen during a fight. There was no argument, no raised voices, no dramatic revelation. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that barely registers in memory unless something internal changes shape. I was sitting alone at the kitchen table, laptop open but untouched, a cup of tea gone cold beside me. Outside, the light was dull and even. Nothing cinematic, nothing symbolic. Just a normal day moving at its usual pace. I had been thinking about a conversation from the night before. Not replaying it obsessively, just holding it. Turning it over slowly, like a stone you've picked up without knowing why. I had mentioned something small, a preference, not even a request. Just information about how I felt. My husband had responded automatically, without looking up, with a phrase I'd heard many times before. "You're reading too much into it." I had nodded. Of course I had. The conversation moved on. But sitting there the next day, something about that response landed differently. It wasn't what he said. It was how quickly my inner experience had been categorized as an error. Not something to explore, but something to correct. For the first time, I didn't ask whether he was right. Instead, I asked myself a different question. When was the last time someone treated my feelings as accurate data? The answer didn't come easily. I realized that I had spent years translating my emotional responses into something more acceptable, more logical, more concise, more palatable. I had been doing this so long that I'd stopped noticing the translation process itself. And suddenly, sitting in that quiet kitchen, I saw it clearly. Nothing was wrong with my perception. The problem wasn't that I felt too much. It was that my feelings were inconvenient to a system that worked better when I stayed agreeable. That realization didn't bring anger. It brought stillness. I didn't feel the urge to confront him. I didn't want to argue my case or demand change. What I felt instead was a kind of internal alignment, like two parts of me that had been out of sync finally met. For the first time, I trusted myself without needing external confirmation. That trust changed everything. I noticed how often I preemptively softened my language, how often I abandoned a thought mid-sentence because I sensed disinterest, how quickly I dismissed my own reactions before anyone else had the chance to, and I saw how much energy that took. I thought about how calm I appeared to others and how much work it required to maintain that appearance. I thought about how being low drama had become synonymous with being low needs, and how that equation had never actually been fair. What shifted wasn't my behavior, not yet. What shifted was my internal posture. I stopped trying to be understood. I stopped explaining myself in advance. I stopped shaping my reactions for optimal reception. I didn't announce this change. No one would have noticed if I had. But inside, something hardened, not in a bitter way, but in a clarified one, like a boundary forming where there had only been flexibility before. I understood then that I didn't need to convince anyone of my worth. I needed to stop negotiating with myself about it. That afternoon, I closed my laptop and took out the leather-bound notebook I'd kept for years. I hadn't written in it consistently. It was just there, a place for thoughts that didn't need editing. I wrote one sentence. I'm not wrong for noticing. It wasn't a manifesto. It wasn't dramatic, but it felt final in a way I couldn't yet explain. That was the day something shifted. Not outwardly, not visibly, but internally, I stopped disappearing. After that day, I didn't suddenly find my voice. What changed was subtler and more deliberate. I became selective with my silence. Before, my quietness had been reflexive, automatic, a default setting designed to maintain harmony. Now it was intentional, measured, observed from the inside rather than imposed from the outside. I stopped filling space just because it existed. When my husband spoke over me, I didn't rush to re-enter the conversation. I let the interruption stand. Not as punishment, not as a test, but as information. I watched what happened when I didn't compensate. When he dismissed a thought lightly, I didn't chase clarification. I noted it. I felt the absence of engagement fully instead of smoothing it over. This kind of silence is uncomfortable, not because it's loud, but because it removes padding. It lets moments land exactly as they are. To him, nothing seemed different at first. That was the most revealing part. He mistook my quiet for compliance, for acceptance, for the same steadiness he had come to rely on. The system still worked. For him. But internally, I was no longer absorbing the weight. I began to separate observation from reaction. Instead of responding emotionally, I watched patterns unfold without intervening. I saw how often conversations centered on his needs, how rarely curiosity moved in my direction unless I initiated it, how accustomed he had become to my emotional availability, and how little he noticed when it receded. This wasn't passive-aggressive silence. I wasn't withholding to provoke a response. I was simply no longer volunteering myself as the stabilizer. At work, the shift mirrored itself. I stopped preempting problems that weren't mine to solve. I let others feel the friction I used to absorb. And just like at home, people noticed the results, but not the cause. They didn't say Eleanor's changed. They said, things feel different lately. That distinction mattered. When silence is a choice, it creates space. And in that space, clarity accumulates. I started keeping quiet records, not of offenses, but of dynamics, dates, phrases, responses. Not to build a case, but to counter the doubt that had lived in me for so long. The doubt that said, you're imagining it, it's not that bad. You're being sensitive. The patterns were consistent, predictable, almost boring in their repetition, and seeing them written down stripped them of their power to confuse me. My husband continued as he always had. He talked, he assumed, he planned, he leaned. And because I no longer met him halfway emotionally, he leaned a little harder, without realizing it. Silence, when chosen, shifts the balance. I felt calmer than I had in years, not because things were better, but because I was no longer internally divided. I wasn't performing peace while negotiating discomfort underneath it. There were moments when I considered breaking the silence, laying everything out, explaining what I was seeing, asking for acknowledgement. But each time I realized something important. I wasn't seeking permission to feel differently anymore, and I wasn't trying to fix the dynamic by myself again. Silence gave me something I hadn't had before: time. Time to see what happened when I stopped managing outcomes. Time to see whether curiosity would emerge on its own. Time to see whether my presence was valued for more than its usefulness. The answers came quietly, and they were clear. What people often misunderstand about quiet people is this: silence does not mean inactivity. While my outward life appeared unchanged, something methodical was unfolding beneath it. Not out of spite, not out of fear, out of clarity. When you stop spending energy explaining yourself, you suddenly have a surplus. And that energy has to go somewhere. Mine went into observation, preparation, and precision. I noticed details I used to gloss over. Financial patterns, emotional labor, who initiated conversations, who followed up, who adjusted. I wasn't hunting for flaws. I was mapping reality as it actually was, not as I hoped it might be. I began reviewing our shared finances with fresh eyes, not because I suspected wrongdoing, but because I realized how little I had questioned assumptions. I had trusted systems I helped maintain without ever auditing them for fairness. I learned, quietly. I reacquainted myself with accounts, contributions, and timelines. I noted what was joint, what was individual, and what was assumed rather than agreed upon. I didn't confront, I didn't hint, I just understood. At the same time, I documented conversations, not verbatim, but in essence. Patterns of dismissal, phrases that recurred, the way certain concerns were consistently reframed as stress or overthinking. Writing them down didn't inflame me, it grounded me. Memory can be negotiated, records cannot. I also started investing in myself in ways that were invisible to others. I updated my professional credentials, reconnected with old contacts, quietly explored opportunities that didn't require permission or explanation. This wasn't secrecy, it was autonomy. My husband didn't notice. Why would he? From his perspective, things were stable, predictable. I was still calm, still capable, still present in the ways that benefited him. He didn't notice that I was no longer sharing my inner world, that I wasn't narrating my thoughts, that I had stopped offering emotional previews. People assume silence means nothing is happening. In reality, silence is often when the most consequential work is done. I noticed how often my husband spoke about me rather than with me, how he summarized my feelings for others without checking if the summary was accurate. I noticed how rarely he asked open-ended questions, and I noticed something else too. When I stopped compensating, small gaps began to appear. Forgotten details, missed cues, emotional missteps that I used to intercept before they reached the surface. Those gaps weren't dramatic, but they were revealing. They showed me how much invisible labor I had been performing just to keep things feeling smooth. And they showed me that the smoothness had never been mutual. I wasn't building a case against him. I wasn't preparing a speech. I was preparing myself for whatever came next, because something had become undeniable. If I continued as before, nothing would change. And if something changed, it would have to begin with me stepping out of the role I had been assigned. The most unsettling realization was this: I could leave without anyone noticing the exact moment I stopped belonging. That thought didn't frighten me. It clarified me. I stopped hinting. I stopped testing. I stopped waiting for him to notice the shift and ask about it. If awareness was going to emerge, it would have to do so without my guidance. It didn't, and that absence of curiosity told me more than any argument ever could. By the time he sensed something was different, the foundation had already moved. He just hadn't felt the tremor yet. The reveal wasn't explosive. There was no moment where I gasped, no sudden discovery that flipped everything upside down. What I uncovered came together slowly, piece by piece, until it formed something undeniable. Clarity rarely arrives loudly. It arrives when enough quiet truths line up. By this point, I had stopped asking myself if something was wrong and started asking what exactly was true. That shift changed how I looked at everything, especially the parts of my life I had previously trusted by default. One evening, alone in the apartment, I spread papers across the dining table. Not in a frantic way, methodically. Bank statements, account summaries, old emails, and agreements we had both signed years earlier without much discussion. Things I had always assumed were balanced because they were shared. They weren't unbalanced in the dramatic sense. Nothing illegal, nothing hidden, just asymmetrical. I saw how often my income had been framed as supportive rather than foundational. My financial contributions were steady but rarely acknowledged as strategic. How decisions that benefited him were framed as long-term, while my priorities were framed as flexible. Flexibility, I realized, had always meant mine. The leverage wasn't a secret account or a betrayal. It was something far more mundane and far more powerful. I was more independent than anyone realized. My credit was stronger, my savings were intentional, my professional standing was portable. The life I had quietly maintained could stand on its own without dramatic restructuring. I had built stability without demanding recognition for it, and because I hadn't demanded recognition, no one had accounted for it. That realization landed without triumph, without anger. It felt almost neutral, like finally seeing the full dimensions of a room you'd been living in with the lights dimmed. I understood then that I wasn't trapped. I had been. I had been undervalued by others, yes, but also by myself, in the ways that mattered most. The private reveal wasn't about power over him. It was about power within me, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that doesn't need validation. I also saw something else clearly. Even if I explained all of this, laid it out calmly, logically, nothing fundamental would shift. Not because he was incapable of change, but because the system worked too well for him as it was. People rarely question arrangements that benefit them, and I no longer felt responsible for educating him at my own expense. There was no celebration in this realization, no sense of winning, just a steady, grounded knowing. I could leave cleanly, not impulsively, not dramatically, cleanly, and that mattered to me, because my moral code had always been simple. No cruelty, no theatrics, no lies. I didn't want to punish. I wanted to exit with integrity intact. The power was not in confrontation. It was a choice. That night, I slept deeply. Not because I was relieved, but because, for the first time in years, my mind wasn't negotiating with itself. There was nothing left to debate. The truth had settled. And once truth settles, it doesn't need reinforcement. It just waits for action. Once you know you can leave, staying becomes a decision, not a default. That was the moment I found myself in. There was no urgency, no countdown clock, no dramatic trigger forcing my hand. Just a quiet intersection where multiple paths were visible, each with its own cost. I could stay and renegotiate the relationship, ask for counseling, articulate my needs clearly, and give him the opportunity to meet them. That path was familiar, respectable. It would allow everyone to say we tried. I could also stay and continue as before, armed now with awareness, better boundaries, lower expectations. I could protect myself internally while keeping the structure intact. Many people live that way. It's survivable. Or I could leave. Not in anger, not as a threat, not as a lesson. Just leave. What made the decision difficult wasn't fear. It was ethics. I asked myself hard questions. Had I truly been clear about my needs? Had I given him enough information to understand the impact of his behavior? Was it fair to exit without one final attempt to repair? These questions mattered to me. I wasn't interested in being right. I was interested in being clean with myself. And the answer came slowly but firmly. I had been clear in the only way that had ever felt safe. Calmly, repeatedly, without dramatics. My needs hadn't been invisible. They had been deprioritized. As for repair, I realized something important. Repair requires mutual curiosity, and curiosity cannot be forced. I could explain everything perfectly and still be met with minimization, defensiveness, or promises that required me to continue monitoring and reminding. That cycle would return me to the role I had already outgrown. Staying would require me to resume emotional management. Leaving would not. The irreversible option wasn't dramatic. It was simply the one that aligned with the person I had become. I thought about the future version of myself, 5 years from now. I asked which choice she would thank me for. Not which one would look better from the outside, but which one would feel lighter internally. The answer was immediate. I didn't announce my decision. I didn't even label it as final in my mind right away. I just began moving in the direction that required the least self-betrayal. I started packing small things, not conspicuously, not all at once, items that mattered to me personally, books, papers, objects with emotional weight, the leather-bound notebook. Each item removed felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I had stored away for convenience. My husband noticed the boxes eventually. He asked casually what I was doing. Organizing, I said. It wasn't a lie. Inside I felt steady, not cold, not resentful, just resolved. The decision point isn't always a dramatic fork in the road. Sometimes it's a quiet narrowing, where one option keeps losing its justification until only one remains. By the time I fully admitted to myself that I was leaving, the emotional work was already done. All that remained was execution. Once the decision was made, my movements became precise. There was no rush, no emotional momentum pushing me forward, just a series of deliberate steps, each one small enough not to disturb the surface of our daily life. This is what moving in silence actually looks like. Not secrecy, but restraint. I consulted a lawyer quietly, framing everything as information gathering rather than action. I wanted to understand the landscape before stepping into it. Timelines, options, boundaries, nothing dramatic, just clarity. I opened an account in my own name, something I should have done years earlier without thinking twice. I redirected a portion of my income, not as an escape plan, but as a declaration of independence, internal more than external. At home, I remained the same on the surface, polite, functional, calm. My husband mistook this consistency for stability. That was the irony. The very composure he had come to rely on was now the thing that allowed me to leave without chaos. I didn't provoke conversations. I didn't pull away theatrically. I didn't punish him with coldness. I simply stopped offering more than was necessary. And because I had always offered so much, the reduction still looked generous. I sorted documents when he wasn't around, photographed what mattered, stored digital copies securely. Again, not out of suspicion, but out of respect for reality. Clean exits require preparation. What surprised me most was how little resistance I felt internally. There was no tug-of-war between loyalty and self-preservation, no last-minute doubt. I had already grieved the relationship while still inside it. That grief had been quiet, slow, and thorough. So now there was only logistics. He began to sense a difference. Not enough to name, but enough to feel. He asked if I was tired, if work was stressful, if everything was okay. Yes, I said, I'm fine. Both were true in different ways. Moving in silence doesn't mean lying. It means not over-explaining. It means letting actions catch up to truth in their own time. I secured a place to stay temporarily. Told only one person, a friend who knew how to hold information without amplifying it. No commentary, no advice, just support. Each step reinforced the same realization. I was capable. I had always been capable. I just hadn't needed to prove it until now. The house began to feel like a hotel I was checking out of. Still familiar, but no longer mine. I noticed details I used to manage without thought, restocking, cleaning, coordinating. I stopped doing the invisible extras, not to make a point, just because I didn't need to anymore. The system started to creak. He noticed things undone, minor inconveniences, gaps where my presence used to smooth everything out. But he still didn't connect them to my withdrawal. That was never my job to explain. Silence carried me forward step by step. By the time the moment arrived, the one that would finally make everything explicit, I was already gone in all the ways that mattered. The first consequences didn't look like consequences. They looked confused. Once I stopped compensating, the system we had built together began to reveal its dependencies. Not all at once, not dramatically, just enough to be felt. My husband started forgetting things, appointments, details I used to track without comment. He asked questions he hadn't needed to ask before. Where something was, when something had been scheduled, how something worked. I answered when it was reasonable. I didn't rush to anticipate. The absence of my constant adjustment created small friction points. Nothing alarming, just enough to register. He grew slightly irritated. Not with me, at first, but with the environment. Things felt less smooth, less efficient. He couldn't quite name why. I watched this without satisfaction. This wasn't vindication, it was information. He also began to talk more, to fill the space I no longer did. He explained his day in greater detail, revisited decisions aloud, looked to me for affirmation I no longer offered automatically. And when that affirmation didn't arrive, he felt it. People often assume that when someone stops giving, they stop caring. That wasn't true. I cared deeply, just differently. I cared enough not to step back into a role that erased me. The most telling consequence was emotional. Without my constant emotional availability, his frustrations lingered longer. There was no buffer to absorb them. No quick reframing to restore equilibrium. He had to sit with his own discomfort, and he didn't like it. He asked me one evening, "Have I done something wrong?" It was a sincere question, not defensive, just unsettled. I looked at him and realized how unfamiliar it was for him to not be reassured immediately. "No," I said calmly, because in that moment it wasn't about wrongdoing. It was about a mismatch. The consequences deepened quietly. He became more attentive in small ways, bringing up topics I had mentioned weeks earlier, asking how work was going. But the attention felt reactive, not curious, as if he sensed something slipping but didn't know what it was. And because he didn't know, he couldn't address it meaningfully. I didn't correct him, I didn't coach him, I didn't say, "This is what you should be noticing." That phase of my life was over. What I saw then was the cost of long-term emotional asymmetry. When one person manages the emotional climate, the other never learns how. Removing myself from that role exposed the imbalance more clearly than any argument ever could. And still, he didn't panic. Not yet. The consequences were too subtle, too quiet, but they were cumulative, and they were moving in only one direction. Panic doesn't always arrive as chaos. Sometimes it arrives as urgency disguised as care. It started with questions, more frequent now, more insistent. "Are you okay? You've been quiet lately. Did I do something?" The tone had shifted. There was concern there, yes, but also something else. A growing awareness that whatever equilibrium he'd been relying on was no longer holding. I could feel him trying to re-engage the version of me he knew how to interact with. The calm explainer, the emotional translator, the woman who reassured him that everything was fine, even when it wasn't. But that woman was no longer available. He suggested date nights, casual check-ins, conversations about us, not confrontational, almost tentative, as if he were testing the ground, unsure where it had started to give way. And that's when I understood something with startling clarity. He wasn't responding to my experience. He was responding to my withdrawal. That distinction mattered. When I had been present but uncomfortable, he hadn't noticed. When I was calm but slowly disappearing, it hadn't alarmed him. Only when the emotional infrastructure I provided was no longer accessible did concern finally surface. By then, the window for repair had closed. Not because repair was impossible, but because it would have required me to step back into the role of guide, to explain what had gone wrong, how long it had been happening, and what needed to change. That labor would have been mine again, and I was done doing it. He asked one night if we could reset. The word lingered between us, heavy with intention. Reset implied returning to an earlier version, one where things felt easier. But ease had always come at my expense. I looked at him and felt something surprising. Not anger, not resentment, but distance. Emotional distance is quiet. It doesn't burn, it simply no longer reaches. "I don't think that's possible," I said. He looked confused. "Why not?" And in that moment, I realized how much explaining it would take. How many examples do I need to provide? How much emotional translation would be required just to get us to the same page? I didn't have the energy or the will for that anymore, because even if he understood, the dynamic would still require monitoring, correction, reminders. I would still be responsible for making sure I wasn't erased again. Too late isn't a punishment. It's a consequence of time. He hadn't missed a single moment. He had missed a pattern, and patterns don't respond to last-minute urgency. I could see the regret forming, not dramatic, not pleading, but unsettled. He wanted to fix something he still didn't fully see, and I didn't need him to see it anymore. That was the final shift. When someone's understanding is no longer required for your peace, the conversation is already over. The attempts continued briefly, small gestures, better listening, more attentiveness. but they landed in a space that had already closed. Not out of cruelty, out of completion. I had finished explaining myself to someone who wasn't ready to listen when it mattered. And now, even though he wanted to fix it, there was nothing left to fix. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't feel like a confrontation at all. There was no surge of adrenaline, no rehearsed speech, no raised voice, trembling with emotion. By the time we sat down across from each other, everything that needed to be felt had already passed through me. What remained was clarity. He asked me to talk. Not urgently, not angrily, just with a seriousness that hadn't been there before. I agreed, because there was nothing left to protect. We sat at the dining table, the same one where I had once spread out papers and discovered my own independence. The familiarity of the space felt almost ironic. "I feel like you've been pulling away," he said, "and I don't know why." I nodded. Not in agreement, in acknowledgement. "I have," I said. There was no accusation in my tone, no bitterness, just a fact. He waited for more, for justification, for emotion. I didn't give it to him. "I'm leaving," I said, calmly, clearly. The words landed between us without impact, like something inevitable finally being named. He blinked. "Leaving?" "Yes." There was a pause, a long one. I let it be long. "Is this because of something I did?" he asked. I considered the question carefully. "Yes," I said, "and because of things you didn't." He looked at me, searching my face for cues. Anger, hurt, vulnerability. I offered none, not because I was hiding them, but because they were no longer present. I didn't list grievances. I didn't catalog moments. I didn't raise my voice or sharpen my words. "I've been disappearing in this marriage," I said, "and I can't do that anymore." He tried to respond, started to explain, to contextualize, to promise. I held up my hand gently, not to silence him, but to slow the moment. "I'm not asking for change," I said. "I'm telling you a decision." That was the moment his posture shifted. The moment he understood this wasn't a negotiation. He asked if we could try counseling, if we could take time, if this were final. I answered each question honestly, briefly, without elaboration. "I've already taken the time. I've already tried." Yes. There was no explosion, no collapse, just a quiet recalibration of reality. He said, "You didn't tell me it was this bad." And for the first time, I felt no urge to defend myself. "I told you in the ways I knew how," I said. "You didn't hear it, and that's not something I can fix now." He looked down at the table. I could see the realization settling, not fully, not cleanly, but enough to hurt. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. We talked logistics after that, calmly, respectfully, like two people closing a chapter that had already ended emotionally. When I stood up to leave the table, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because I had won something, but because I had stopped carrying something that wasn't mine to hold anymore. The confrontation had no heat because there was nothing left to burn. Only truth. After I left, people expected me to unravel. They checked in cautiously, as if waiting for the delayed emotional collapse they assumed must follow a decision like that. Friends asked how I was really doing, lowering their voices, as though grief were something fragile and contagious. I understood their concern. From the outside, leaving a marriage, especially a calm one, looks like loss. But what I felt wasn't devastation. It was an expansion. Without the constant background noise of self-monitoring, my days grew quieter in a different way. Not empty. Clear. I woke up without bracing myself for the emotional weather of someone else. I made decisions without translating them into someone else's comfort. That freedom was subtle but profound. I noticed how my body responded first. My shoulders relaxed. My breath deepened. I slept without that low-level vigilance I hadn't known I was carrying. Emotionally, I felt steady, not euphoric, not bitter, just aligned. I didn't rewrite history to make myself the hero. I didn't demonize my husband to justify leaving. I allowed the story to remain complex, human, incomplete. What changed was how I related to myself. I no longer dismissed my reactions as overthinking. I treated my feelings as information again, accurate even when they were inconvenient. I trusted the part of me that notices patterns, that feels misalignment before it becomes visible. That trust became my new foundation. I also learned something unexpected. Quiet strength doesn't need to prove itself. It doesn't need to be recognized to exist. It simply moves when it's time. I still speak calmly. I still listen carefully. Those traits didn't disappear when I left. The difference is that I no longer offer them indiscriminately. I no longer equate composure with self-sacrifice. I have boundaries now, not rigid walls, but clear edges. And the people in my life respond to those edges with respect, or they don't stay close. Both outcomes are acceptable. I'm no longer interested in being the easiest person in the room. I'm interested in being present, fully, honestly, without editing myself for comfort. When I think back on the woman I was, I don't judge her. She did what she knew how to do. She survived by adapting. But the woman I am now doesn't need to disappear to maintain peace. Peace that requires erasure isn't peace at all. I live more simply, more intentionally. My life isn't louder, it's truer, and that has made all the difference. There's a certain kind of ending that doesn't feel like an ending at all. It doesn't slam the door or demand applause. It doesn't come with a speech that ties everything into a neat bow. It arrives quietly, with the simple understanding that something has been completed and doesn't need revisiting to be real. That's the kind of ending this story has. If there's a moral here, it isn't about leaving. It's about listening, especially to the parts of yourself that speak softly, the ones that don't interrupt or demand attention, the ones that get used to waiting. Those parts carry the earliest warnings. They notice when your needs are consistently deprioritized, when your presence is appreciated more for its function than its truth, when calmness becomes a requirement instead of a choice. And they wait patiently until you're ready to hear them. What ended my marriage wasn't cruelty or betrayal. It was a sentence that revealed a truth too clearly to ignore. My husband told me to calm down while I was packing to leave. That sentence didn't cause the ending. It confirmed it. Because when someone tells you to calm down in a moment that requires respect, not regulation, it shows you how they see you. Not as an equal in that moment, but as something to be managed. And once you see that clearly, pretending not to becomes impossible. This story isn't an instruction to leave your relationship. It's not an argument for ultimatums or silence as a strategy. It's an invitation to notice. Notice who adjusts first. Notice whose feelings are treated as data and whose are treated as disruption. Notice whether your calm is coming from strength or from long practice at self-erasure. Quiet dominance isn't about control over others. It's about control over your own participation. It's knowing when to speak, when to wait, and when to walk away without needing to be understood. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stop explaining. If this story resonated with you, even in small ways, I'd like to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a moment where someone said something ordinary, almost casual, and you realized it changed everything? You don't have to share details if you don't want to. Even naming the feeling is enough. Because when these stories are told out loud, quietly, without spectacle, they help others recognize their own turning points too. And that kind of recognition can be the beginning of something honest.
Cảm ơn các bạn vì đã theo dõi đến cuối. Đừng quên ấn like, share và bật chuông để không bỏ lỡ những video mới nhất nhé. Hẹn gặp lại.